Andreas, in your paper and in your presentation, you're given an interesting argument that the thing to explain in Russia, when comparing Russia and Ukraine, is not the strength of the right-wing parties in Ukraine, especially, but their weakness. Could you elaborate more about that?
Well, this is just a sort of intellectual operation that I've chosen Russia to compare Ukraine with, and the approach is basically we have two, one could argue, relatively similar countries, or at least countries that found themselves after the breakup of the Soviet Union in some regards in a similar situation. They're Eastern Slavic, Orthodox Christian, they went through deep crisis, they suffer from oligarchy, neo-patrimonialism, from all sorts of problems that are rather similar. But if we look on the electoral performance of radical right parties and also of the violence, of the amount of hate crimes committed in both countries, there are stark differences. And the differences are such that in Russia we have much larger expressions of right-wing extremism, both in the electoral realm and also in the extra-parliamentary realm than in Ukraine. And that's a paradox that needs to be explained, and I offer a few hypotheses what could be the explanation.
One of the ideas we often hear these last days is that maybe the electoral score of the right-wing parties is weaker, but the nationalistic ideas are much more present in mainstream parties. What would you answer to that?
Well, it depends on what you mean by nationalism. Of course, what we have in Ukraine is a lot of patriotism and the idea of national independence and liberation, national identity, but that is something to be expected in one could call a post-colonial country, in a country that used to be a colony of first the Tsarist and then the Soviet Empire. But I think it would be wrong to say that the electorates of the big parties in Ukraine, let's say of the Poroshenko bloc, the People's Front, the Self-Help Party, could be called ultra-nationalist. I think that would be wrong. On the contrary, when Svoboda had its electoral success in 2012 and received more than 10%, the electorate was untypical of Svoboda because it consisted of many people who were highly educated, came from large cities, were pro-European, pro-democratic, but chose to give their support for Svoboda. So actually this support that Svoboda got in 2012 was more than the actual support for ultra-nationalism in Ukraine.
One of the questions that are widely discussed now in academic communities studying Ukraine is how can one be critical? What are the effects of criticism and putting the finger where it hurts now in contemporary Ukraine, given that we are in a war situation with an information war? What could be the socially responsible position of the researcher?
Yeah, the uncomfortable situation one finds oneself in is that as social scientists, I think our self-definition is that we should be critical, that we should be skeptical, that we should not believe the state, that we should be in a way anti-statist, that we should talk against the mainstream, we should talk against the mainstream press, and that's our function in society. However, now we are in a situation where our critical arguments can be misused in an information war that is nothing less than the justification and rationalization of territorial expansion and of war and of aggressive foreign policies. That's a peculiar situation, and we cannot escape this particular situation. And I think the solution to this is that we should keep our criticism in context. So we should both criticize current Ukrainian events in consideration of the specificity of the current Ukrainian situation, but also in consideration of similar problems in other countries where there's no so-called civil war, where the country does not fall apart, but which have these problems and for some reason do exist for decades, for centuries, but for some reason they do not have the same sort of fundamental problems of state building that Ukraine today has. And then if we contextualize it in that way, then I think we can still be critical without providing ammunition for the Russian propaganda war.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you.